Hello, sorry for the gap. Hopefully I was able to eliminate it. I paused the screen share rather than the recording when I took a little break. So this is part two of what was intended to be one part. So mental illness I had not is another aspect of health, obviously, beyond physical health. There are physical aspects to mental health and mental illness, but uh, there are also sociological aspects and considerations and class-based differences in how people presenting themselves with various symptoms to a psychiatrist will be diagnosed. Mental illness includes a lot of conditions like just major depression, dysthymia, which is chronic depression, anxiety disorders, psychoses like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder. There are many individually coded disorders and considered mental illnesses. And we've seen several cases recently where a situation that should have been handled by some mental health professionals of some sort, if they existed in a particular community, situation ended up in the death of someone who was having a psychotic episode, whether brought on by a lack of medication, being unmedicated, or perhaps drug use with a predisposing condition to psychosis, or some other situation that has led to that was handled by the police and handled in such a way that lethal force was applied, and someone who was having a mental health emergency ended up dead. So um, it connects back to other issues that we've discussed. So part of the discussions surrounding this catch-all phrase of defunding police involves simply shifting some money from the budget to community mental health resources, because there are many cases like this throughout the United States where the police have ended up involved in something they weren't really trained or to handle appropriately. So uh, there are anecdotal reports these days from mental health workers and so forth that rates of anxiety disorders, stress related disorders, depression, even suicide, and so forth have been increasing as a result of the pandemic. But, the comprehensive, reliable statistics have not yet been compiled. So I can't present any of that, but it certainly makes sense. This is a very stressful period of time, and stress is definitely a trigger for depression. Depression can in some cases lead someone to take their own life. So um, it wouldn't be surprising if that were the case. If we see the suicide rate spike a bit during this period. Uh, so here's a link to resources for coping with COVID. Uh, if you need to find some other resources for whatever reason. And this is a couple of the things that are available at that website. So it probably is useful just for you to read through. Sociologists had classically been very interested in mental illness as a type of deviance, behavioral deviance. Deviance is defined, as you may have seen already in another lecture, as simply behavior that someone else believes you should not be engaged in. You're doing something you should not do. or they would prefer you not do. In some cases, that deviance involves violating a norm that is etched into the legal code, and it's called a crime. But often, things that are crimes later become legalized. For instance, we're seeing the legalization for recreational of marijuana for recreational use in a number of states. Um, for a period of time in the United States, the use of alcohol was illegal, or definitely the sale, distribution, etc., was illegal, and possession was illegal. So it was the era of prohibition from 1919 and 1931. I believe it was 1919. So could have been a little later. Anyway, sociologists have, as I said, classically been interested in these issues. Emile Durkheim, one of the founders of sociology, the first of the big names to call himself a sociologist, did a major study of suicide, a study in sociology, which was the first application of actual data in a case study to try to understand the pattern that he observed in European society, anyway, where there was a variation in suicide rates that seemed to correlate with religious affiliations. I won't go into that study now, but it highlighted how social factors could play a role in leading someone to find themselves in a mental space where they would take their own life rather than continue on the path they were on, expected to be on. So symbolic interactionists have been very interested in mental health issues as a subset of deviance. Howard Becker has said the deviant is simply someone that has been successfully labeled as such by agents of social control, which can be the police, the courts, the medical community, social workers, etc. So mental illness is unlike other illnesses, though, in that it's many people, probably most people, would not ever consider a friend or a relative who had a mental illness to really be cured ever. It's not something you can get a clean bill of health on, like many other illnesses, so many others. And there's a stigma attached to being labeled or treated for mental illness. And it can be, it can put you in a category where you're not fully participating in society to the extent that others are. You're set apart in a sense. So that's changing to a certain extent, but not completely. It's probably best if you are, people have opened up a lot, particularly about depression and bipolar disorder and so forth, but it's not something you should talk about with a potential employer or probably a potential marriage partner right away anyway. Save it until you get a sense of whether they can handle it or not. If you think they can't, take that into account. So anyway, still a stigma. Social constructionist model of mental illness as opposed or is distinct from a medical model of mental illness. Thomas Scheff, who's a symbolic interactionist and develops labeling theory as applied to mental illness, he calls mental illness a social construction with real consequences. But of course, we know that social constructions do have real consequences. But in this case, the person so labeled begins to see himself or herself as mentally disordered once the process is complete. Here is a comparison of the two approaches to mental illness. There's a table showing the past year prevalence through, I guess, 2018, since it was published in 2019, of any mental illness, which is a pretty broad category, broken out by gender, age, and race ethnicity as well. Okay, by prevalence, the percent, what percent of the population presented symptoms to a physician that the physician diagnosed as one of these many mental illnesses? It's pretty high, really. 31% of people had two or more. So, you know, it's more, most of these are going to be depression and anxiety. You look at percentage of Americans with one of the more serious of the mental illnesses, which is basically it's the type of thing that just interferes with your daily life. You're unable to function as one normally would. You have trouble working, relating to others. This includes things like major depression, psychosis, bipolar disorder. It doesn't include ADHD or some of the personality disorders, or I'm not sure if PTSD is one of those or not. This is from the National Institutes of Medical Health, by the way, their definition here of a serious mental illness. So the prevalence of, compared to any mental illness, it's obviously lower, but it's still fairly high. And you can see a pattern of age as well as ethnicity and gender. Okay, as we've noted already, not everyone has access to health care. Mental health care is really no less expensive necessarily, at least in terms of the drugs and the physician's visits, than other forms of health care. So here is a chart showing what percent of adults with a serious mental illness actually receive some sort of services from the medical establishment or social welfare agencies. They got something. And you see again differences between age groups and patterns of race and ethnicity, where and again this reflects income for the most part, as well as other things that we've already discussed. Here's the past year prevalence of major depressive episode among U.S. adults in 2017. So you can just take a look at that. It seems to have been higher among 18 to 25-year-olds. It's higher among white Americans and higher for women. So this is in part of the lower number for men, maybe due to the fact that men resist going to a physician if they have a problem. Suicide, as I said, depression can lead to suicide. It does not always. Suicide rate's been increasing since 1999. And it is known that a person that has major depression or bipolar type 2 disorder, you're more likely to attempt or commit suicide. 7% of men with lifelong history of depression commit suicide. Lifelong history chronic depression is dysthymia. And according to Department of Health and Human Services, 60% of persons who commit suicide had some sort of mental illness diagnosed in their past. Mood disorder is another term for a subcategory of mental illness that excludes things like ADHD and gender dysphoria and whatnot. Um, Not that gender dysphoria is a mental illness, but it is in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, I believe, still. There are a number of things in that book that psychiatrists use to diagnose and code for insurance purposes a particular set of symptoms. Of late, they've modified the last revision of this manual, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. They added a few things like grief. Grief is now something that you should have treated by a doctor with antidepressants, presumably. They added one as well called minor neurocognitive disorder, which is basically forgetting details as you get older, or more and more often as you get older. It's nice to have a label, but there is no treatment, so I guess it's a little more than a label, but I'm happy they included me this time. So here's some more statistics about suicide. It may not totally align with what I gave you from other sources earlier, but I'm not even sure what year this refers to. But here you can see the pattern of suicides over time. Overall, well, okay, this is men, the overall rate, and women right here. You see it climbing. It dropped a bit in 2018 for men, but not for the overall population because there was an increase in the rate for women. This is suicides per 100,000 people, by the way. It's not percentages. Right? And just some more things to remember because we're all under a lot of distress right now. Well, a lot of stress, not necessarily distress, but I just happen to see that word, disaster distress. So stress, anxiety, fear, it's a hard time. And that's all I have for you.